Social Sciences, IIT Bombay. Siddharth will be speaking first, and then Professor Surya. A brief introduction about Siddharth. As we all know, Siddharth has been a seasoned journalist and is a founding editor of The Wire. The Wire has been doing really exemplary quality journalism work that is standing up to the powers that be it either the state or the corporates or the powerful people. Relevantly to this meeting, The Wire is part of international consortium of media houses that is investigating into the globalized hacking using Pegasus malware. In relevance to that, Siddharth will be speaking on the surveillance state. A couple of announcements before we hand it over to Siddharth. The question and answer segment will commence after both the speakers complete their talks. We urge all the participants to type out their questions in the chat box addressed to the respective speakers. We will convey to them and they will respond accordingly. There is this fascinating website, balagopal.org, that will take you the entire corpus of Balagopal in both English and Telugu. The site has been in place for many years and now we have upgraded it recently. We would like to draw your attention particularly to the book Probings in the Political Economy of Agrarian Classes and Conflicts. This was published in 1988, one of the classics of Balagopal's work, and now it is being reissued with a new foreword by the noted development economist John Rees. Look it up, you would like it. We are very soon bringing out a compilation of Balagopal's writings on law, jurisprudence, and legal praxis in Telugu. This is the first volume of Balagopal's writings on judiciary, and this is the 32nd volume of Balagopal's Telugu corpus. Now I will just briefly speak about this in Telugu. Andarki namaskaram andi. Na peru Rohit, nenu Manav Hakkula Vedika కార్యకర్తని. ఈ రోజు మనం ఇక్కడ బాలగోపాల్ గారి సంస్మరించుకోవడం మనం ఇక్కడ ఈ రోజు కలిసి ఉన్నాము. మానవ హక్కుల వేదిక ఇది 12వ బాలగోపాల్ సంస్మరణ సమావేశం. బాలగోపాల్ గారు మానవ హక్కుల వేదిక వ్యవస్థాపక సభ్యులు. అలాగే దాదాపు 3 దశాబ్దాల పాటు ఆయన తెలుగు రాష్ట్రాలు కానీ బయట కానీ చాలా పేరుగానిన హక్కుల కార్యకర్త. ఆయన అక్టోబర్ 8, 2009 నాడు అనుకోకుండా ఆరోగ్య కారణాల రీత్యా ఆయన చనిపోయారు. అప్పటి నుంచి మనం బాలగోపాల్ సంస్మరణ సభ జరుపుకుంటూ వచ్చాము. 2019 వరకు మనం హైదరాబాద్ సుందరయ్య విజ్ఞాన కేంద్రంలో ఫిజికల్ మీటింగ్లు పెట్టుకున్నాము. కోవిడ్ వచ్చిన కాడి నుంచి మనం ఆన్లైన్కి షిఫ్ట్ అయ్యాము. క్రితం సంవత్సరం తీసా సతల్వాద్ గారు మాట్లాడారు. ఈ సంవత్సరం మనకి ఇద్దరు చాలా ముఖ్యమైన వక్తలు మన ముందు ఉన్నారు. సిద్ధార్థ్ వదరాజన్ గారు, ఆయన ద వైర్ మీడియా హౌస్ వ్యవస్థాపక సంపాదకులు. అలాగే ప్రొఫెసర్ సూర్యకాంత్ వాగ్మోరే గారు, ఆయన ఐఐటి బాంబేలోని డిపార్ట్మెంట్ ఆఫ్ హ్యుమానిటీస్ అండ్ సోషల్ సైన్సెస్లో ఆచార్యులు. మొదట సిద్ధార్థ్ గారు మాట్లాడతారు, దాని తర్వాత సూర్యకాంత్ వాగ్మోరే గారు మాట్లాడతారు. ఇప్పుడు సిద్ధార్థ్ గారు గురించి చెప్పాలంటే, సిద్ధార్థ్ గారు దాదాపు ఒక 3 దశాబ్దాల పైనే చాలా ప్రముఖ పాత్రికేయులు. అలాగే ద వైర్ మీడియా హౌస్ వ్యవస్థాపక సంపాదకులు కూడా. వైర్ మనందరికీ తెలిసిందే, పెద్ద పెద్ద కార్పొరేట్ సంస్థలకు కానీ రాజ్యానికి కానీ చాలా పవర్ఫుల్ వ్యక్తులకు కానీ వాళ్ళకి గట్టిగా నిలబడి వాళ్ళ జవాబుదారీతనం కానీ పారదర్శకత కానీ చాలా గట్టిగా చేస్తుంది. వాళ్ళ మీద ఇప్పటి వరకు ఎన్నో కేసులు పెట్టారు, పరువు నష్ట దావాలు వేశారు. అదాని అంబానీ లాంటి కార్పొరేట్ సంస్థలు వాళ్ళ వెనకాల పడి ఉన్నాయి, వాళ్ళ మీద ఎన్నో పరువు నష్ట దావాలు వేశారు, కొన్ని వేల కోట్లు పరువు నష్ట దావాలు వేశారు. వాళ్ళు ఆ విధంగా పనిచేసుకుంటూ వస్తున్నారు కాబట్టి వాళ్ళ మీద ఇన్ని జరుగుతూ ఉన్నాయి. అలాగే ఈ మధ్యకాలంలో మనందరికీ తెలుసు, పెగాసస్ అనే పెద్ద ఇష్యూ వచ్చింది. ఈ పెగాసస్ అనే ఒక మాల్వేర్తో ప్రపంచవ్యాప్తంగా జరిగిన హ్యాకింగ్ గురించి ఇన్వెస్టిగేషన్ చేస్తున్న ప్రపంచవ్యాప్త మీడియా సంస్థల్లో వైర్ కూడా ఒకటి. దానికి అనుబంధంగా ఈరోజు సిద్ధార్థ్ గారు సర్వైలెన్స్ స్టేట్ అంటే నిఘా రాజ్యం అనే విషయం మీద మాట్లాడతారు. సిద్ధార్థ్ గారు మాట్లాడే ముందు కొన్ని అనౌన్స్మెంట్లు. ప్రశ్న జవాబు సెషను ఇద్దరు వక్తలు మాట్లాడేసిన తర్వాత ప్రశ్న జవాబుల సెషన్ ఉంటుంది. మీకు ఏమైనా ప్రశ్నలు ఉంటే కనుక వాటిని ఇక్కడ చాట్ బాక్స్ ఉంది కదా, చాట్ బాక్స్లో మీరు దాన్ని రాయగలరు. మీరు ఇంగ్లీష్లోనే రాయొచ్చు, తెలుగులోనే రాయొచ్చు. మీరు ఎవరిని ఉద్దేశించి ఆ ప్రశ్న రాస్తున్నారో వాళ్ళ పేరు కూడా అక్కడ రాస్తే మనం ఇద్దరు వక్తలు మాట్లాడేసిన తర్వాత ఆ వక్తల్ని వాటికి జవాబు ఇవ్వమని మనం అడగొచ్చు. తర్వాత మంది balagopal.org అని బాలగోపాల్ గారి మొత్తం తెలుగు ఇంగ్లీష్ రచనా సర్వస్వం మొత్తం అందుబాటులో ఉంది. అందరూ ఆ వెబ్సైట్ని చూస్తే కనుక బాలగోపాల్ రచన సర్వస్వం కానీ, ఆయన ఉపన్యాసాలు కానీ, ఆయన రాసిన కరపత్రాలు కానీ, నివేదికలు కానీ అన్నీ అందులో ఉన్నాయి. అది చాలా సంవత్సరాల నుంచి balagopal.org వెబ్సైట్ ఉంది. అది ఈ మధ్య కాలంలో మనం దాన్ని అప్గ్రేడ్ చేసాము. మొత్తం అంతా నీట్‌గా చేసి ఒక క్రమ పద్ధతిలో పెట్టుకుంటా వచ్చాము. అలాగే 1988లో బాలగోపాల్ గారి మొదటి పుస్తకం ఇంగ్లీష్‌లో ప్రోబింగ్స్ ఇన్ పొలిటికల్ ఎకానమీ ఆఫ్ అగ్రేరియన్ క్లాసెస్ అండ్ కాన్ఫ్లిక్ట్స్ అని అది పర్స్పెక్టివ్స్ ప్రచురణ సంస్థ ప్రచురించింది. దాన్ని మళ్ళీ మనం ఇప్పుడు తీసుకొస్తున్నాము. అందులో బాలగోపాల్ గారి 80వ దశకంలో రాసిన ఇంగ్లీష్ వ్యాసాలు, ముఖ్యంగా ఈపీడబ్ల్యూ వీటిలో రాసిన ఆంగ్ల వ్యాసాలన్నీ కొన్నిటిని కూర్చి ఆ పుస్తకం తీసుకొచ్చాము. ఇప్పుడు ఈ పుస్తకాన్ని మళ్ళీ తీసుకొస్తున్నాం. ఈసారి దీనికి చాలా ప్రముఖ ఆర్థికవేత్త అయిన జాన్ రీస్ గారు ముందు మాట రాశారు. మీరు ఆ వెబ్సైట్ చూసినా, ఈ పుస్తకాన్ని చూసినా చాలా విలువైనది మీకు తెలుస్తాయి చాలా విషయాలు. కాబట్టి చూడాలని చెప్పి అడుగుతున్నాం. అలాగే ఇప్పుడు బాలగోపాల్ గారు న్యాయ వ్యవస్థ మీద, న్యాయ పద్ధతుల మీద రాసిన పుస్తకాన్ని మనం త్వరలో తీసుకొస్తున్నాం. ఈ నెలాఖరికల్లా వస్తుంది అది. అది బాలగోపాల్ గారు న్యాయ వ్యవస్థ మీద, న్యాయ పద్ధతుల మీద, ఇత్యాది విషయాల మీద రాసిన పుస్తకాల్లో ఇది మొదటి సంపుటం. దీని తర్వాత ఇంకా వస్తాయి. అలాగే మొత్తం బాలగోపాల్ తెలుగు రచన సర్వస్వంలో ఇది 32వ సంపుటి. ఇప్పటి వరకు ఈ పుస్తకంతో కలిపి బాలగోపాల్ గారు తెలుగులో రాసినవి 32 సంపుటాలుగా వేసాం మనం. Now, we request Siddharth to take over. Siddharth?
Unmute Chesk. Siddharth, you have to unmute.
No, I couldn't unmute. You have to unmute me.
I just did.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to take part in today's event. K. Balagopal was somebody who played an exemplary role in the defense of human rights, democratic rights, civil liberties in India. And in many ways, the topic that I've been asked to speak on today, which is on surveillance, goes to the heart of many of the human rights concerns. Of course, in a different fashion. Many of the technologies and means used to subject citizens to surveillance, and also the manner in which this is happening perhaps were unheard of 10, 20 years ago. But the essential impulse driving the surveillance activities of the Indian state are exactly the same impulses which are propelling a whole host of rights violations. So in that way, surveillance and the means to which, or the uses to which surveillance are put by the Indian state today are very much an essential part of any meaningful discussion on human rights and the challenges to human rights. So thank you very much for asking me to speak today and for selecting this topic. Before I speak, it's the central thesis of my talk today is that surveillance as deployed by the Indian state is not simply a question of violating an individual citizen's right to privacy. By phrasing it in that way, I don't mean to minimize the importance of the right to privacy. I think every individual regards her or his right to privacy as a central part of their being, central part of their human rights. And the Supreme Court of India in Puttaswamy has recognized the right to privacy as an essential part of the right to life. So I don't mean to minimize this very essential right when I say that surveillance is not simply a violation of privacy rights. What I mean to say is that surveillance as deployed by the Indian state today goes well beyond violating the rights of the individuals who have been subjected to surveillance, and actually represents an assault on the democratic rights of everybody. And the reason I say this, and the reason I think it's important to say this and to recognize this, is because at one level, there is a tendency to make light of some of the disclosures and revelations that have come in the past month or two about surveillance, and to say, well, do we really need to worry so much about spyware, Pegasus, surveillance? After all, it's only a handful of people who are being subjected to surveillance. Or you have persons connected to the ruling establishment who suggest the only people who need to worry about surveillance are those who have something bad to hide. So there is this tendency to make light of the problem of surveillance by saying, oh, this is just a problem of a few individuals, and what's the big deal? And the starting point of my analysis today is that this is a very big deal, because surveillance as deployed represents an assault on citizens as a whole, even if their own devices and phones have not been hacked into, even if they themselves as individuals are not subjected to surveillance. There is a wider issue of assault on their rights, which we need to focus on. And before I go into the specifics of the form that surveillance takes today, or the most extreme form that surveillance takes today, I want to establish the context, which is that over the past 7 years, since 2014, this country has been subjected to a sustained, systematic assault on democratic institutions of the kind that we have perhaps not seen for the past 70, 75 years. And I say this despite the fact that the country went through a formal emergency between 75 to 77. That assault lasted 2 years. Of course, during those 2 years, the measures taken by the government against the people, in some regards, was much more repressive than what we see today, much more far-reaching. But it was a 2-year period. And there were, of course, many, many differences between some of the measures taken during the emergency and what we see today in what many call an undeclared or unrecognized emergency. But the key difference to bear in mind is that we are looking at a 7-year long assault, and one that appears to be intensifying with each passing year, and which is taking forms of repression, maybe because they are not so overt, are therefore far more insidious, far more dangerous. But my talk is not primarily focused on the assault on democracy as a whole. I spoke about this last week at a session, virtual session organized by the Manthan Forum in Hyderabad, where I looked at the overall assault taking place on different institutions of democracy, different on the media, of course, on parliamentary practice, on every institution which is supposed to provide the citizen with the ability to hold the authorities in check. That assault is happening. So I don't want to repeat what I said in that lecture, but it's important to bear that in mind as context. That in the last 7 years, you have a government which has a sweeping majority in the Lok Sabha and has used its power in order to weaken and whittle away every possible source of opposition, whether it be in parliament, whether it be from different institutions, whether it be the media. And that is the context in which we need to consider the consequences of the kind of surveillance techniques that this government has employed. In other words, we are looking at a situation where you have a government that is more powerful than any that we have experienced in the last 70 years, that faces less challenge inside parliament or outside, less opposition or challenge from the media, less pushback from constitutional institutions, and yet this government feels the need to arm and equip itself with added weapons so as to ensure that its power literally goes completely unquestioned and unchallenged. So this, I feel, the fact that surveillance techniques are being employed as a tool of political domination, the fact that this is happening when a government already enjoys the kind of power that it does, makes the situation even more dangerous and difficult for the rest of us. That's what I wanted to say by way of setting the political tone and background of India as a surveillance state. Now, in 2019, a number of people in India received messages from WhatsApp and from a North American-based laboratory called Citizen Lab, informing them that their phones had been hacked into or been targeted for hacking by some unidentified hacker or unidentified agency using an Israeli spyware called Pegasus. We know from a letter that WhatsApp wrote. WhatsApp is, as you know, social media company owned by Facebook. And we know from a letter that WhatsApp wrote to the government of India's Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT, in 2019, that around 120 or 121 Indians or people living in India were the targets of spyware. And according to an answer provided in Parliament by the then IT Minister, I believe it was Ravi Shankar Prasad or his deputy, sometime in November or December 2019, something like 20 of those phones actually had, WhatsApp had evidence or proof of data being added or taken away, some kind of active surveillance using Pegasus. Now, this was a problem that WhatsApp identified as having occurred in a 12-day period from roughly March 21st or 22nd, 2019, up to April 2nd or 3rd, 2019. So in a 12-day window, WhatsApp said it detected something like 1,400 cases worldwide, of which 120 were in India, where Pegasus appears to have either been successfully used or attempted to be used against these people. In deference to the privacy concerns of its customers, WhatsApp didn't reveal the names of those Indians who had been targeted, but something like 20 or 21 people came forward to say that they had been notified by WhatsApp, and this list is in the public domain. Many of them wrote to the Standing Committee of Parliament for Information Technology, headed by Shashi Tharoor, demanding an inquiry. Many of them wrote to the government, demanding that some answers be given to them. And these targets include a host of human rights activists, Anil Teltumde, many of those who were targeted in the Bhima Koregaon case, many activists in Chhattisgarh, all of them, in other words, connected in some way or the other to the struggle for the human rights of people in India. And the government, when asked about this in Parliament, essentially pretended as if it had nothing to do with its own functioning and said, well, we have written to WhatsApp asking for more information. This is when Pegasus, as a spyware, entered the public domain in India, and we knew for a fact that around 120 people had been targeted using this spyware. Now, a word about what Pegasus is and who makes it. Pegasus is military-grade spyware made by an Israeli company called NSO Group. This is a company that was set up by former Israeli military intelligence people who had developed communication interception technologies while serving with the Israeli military or the Israeli intelligence. And when they left the Israeli military, they set up a private company where they developed these surveillance techniques. And essentially what this involves is the hacking, finding a way to hack into the smartphone of a target so that you can implant your spyware on this phone. And once you successfully do that, you can essentially break into all communication of your target, not just calls that are placed over a cellular network or SMSs, which is the kind of surveillance which the government of India or any government would attempt to do through lawful means. So in India, for example, under the IT Act and under the earlier Telegraph Act of the 19th century, there is a prescribed procedure by which the government of India can place telephone numbers under surveillance and obtain recordings or messages sent and exchanged through the telephone network. Now, this refers to unencrypted messages or phone calls placed by targets, and there is a prescribed procedure for this. If it's the Union of India which is doing it, the Home Secretary has to authorize surveillance. This is for a limited period of time. There is sadly no judicial oversight, but nevertheless, there is some kind of official mechanism which the Supreme Court has insisted governments have to follow. What Pegasus does is that it fills a vital gap in the intelligence agencies' attempts to obtain information from a target, which is that with the rise of internet telephony and the use of encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram, because these messages are end-to-end encrypted, even if the government of India's agencies use lawful interception methods, obtain and the procedure is very simple. You have to obtain the assistance of the telecom or internet service provider so that you can patch into messages or phone calls as they are being exchanged. But since these messages, say on WhatsApp or Signal, are encrypted, and WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram refuse to share an iMessage, Apple refuses to share the encryption key with the government of India, it is no use for them to get hold of these encrypted messages as they are being sent back and forth. What Pegasus does is that it helps intelligence agencies read even encrypted messages, because it opens for the Pegasus operator a window into everything that your phone does. So literally the screen that you as a target are watching is replicated on the computer screen of the person who has deployed Pegasus against you. So all your encrypted messages are no longer secret. However, Pegasus goes one step further. It can activate the microphone on your phone. It can activate the camera. The operator can get your phone to secretly video record or audio record without your knowledge, and then transmit the recordings made secretly back to the operator. In short, it gives government or whoever has deployed Pegasus against you full visibility, full access to everything that you do, everything you say, everything you see, conversations you have, either on the phone or in person, if you carry your phone with you. And it provides unprecedented access into the life of an intended target. Now, in 2019, the government of India kind of pretended that it knew nothing about this. It said, well, we have written to WhatsApp asking for more details. I believe the minister also said that we have written to NSO, the Israeli company. However, a recent right to information request made to the IT ministry asking for a copy of that communication, both to WhatsApp and NSO, produced a 2-line email that was sent to WhatsApp. And there is no record that has been shared so far by the government with a right to information applicant about what exactly is it that the government of India wrote to NSO group about. And my hunch is that the government of India perhaps never bothered to write to NSO. And there was a very good reason why it didn't do that. Now, fast forward from 2019 to 2021. My colleague M.K. Venu and I were approached by a French-based media nonprofit called Forbidden Stories sometime in March 2021 with the information that they had a database of numbers of actual or potential Pegasus victims. Our numbers were on that list, and they asked us whether we would agree to have our phones examined forensically in order to authenticate whether, in fact, we have been targeted by Pegasus or not. Both of us agreed. We uploaded a backup of our phone, some of the data, and this was analyzed by Amnesty International's Tech Lab. And the conclusion came back that both phones were indeed infected with Pegasus. And Forbidden Stories said that according to their database, there were more than 1,000 Indian numbers. And would the Wire be interested in joining an international media consortium of different newspapers and media platforms around the world that were investigating the use of Pegasus worldwide, and we readily agreed. Our work on the project began in May, and we had roughly a month and a half to examine and investigate 1,000+ numbers, try to understand who these numbers belong to, try to approach the owners of these numbers in order to see whether they would cooperate with our story and agree to have their phone forensically examined. And I won't bore you with the details. This was a difficult task journalistically, because we also had to preserve confidentiality and secrecy during this entire period to make sure that the government of India or any other agency did not find out what we were doing. To cut a long story short, of the 1,000+ numbers that we had, we were able to positively identify a few hundred. And we approached roughly 50 odd people with a request that they allow us to forensically examine the contents of their phone. Of the 50 people that we approached, roughly 21 or 22 people agreed to do that. And we were able to conduct a forensic examination on their phones. So that's basically around, I think, 21 or 22 phones. And we were able to establish, with the cooperation of Amnesty International, that around 14 or 15 phones out of the 21 or 22 that we forensically examined either had evidence of a Pegasus infection or showed evidence of an attempted Pegasus infection. And of these infected phones, several belonged to journalists. I already mentioned that my phone and M.K. Venu's phones were positively infected, and we established this through forensic examination. But also Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, S.N.M. Abadi, Sushant Singh, former defense editor of the Indian Express, a couple of human rights activists, but also the well-known opposition political strategist Prashant Kishore. When we examined his phone, we found the presence of Pegasus going back more than 2 years, but most worryingly, Pegasus had been deployed, and we saw this through the forensic footprint. Pegasus had been deployed against Prashant Kishore's phone during the West Bengal election campaign of 2021. Apart from the phones that we forensically examined and found actual traces of Pegasus in, there were dozens of phones of political people, business people, human rights people, whose phones could not be tested or examined for a variety of reasons. But we have strong reason to believe the presence of their numbers or the numbers of their associates on our database is strongly indicative of their probable targeting by Pegasus. And among the people included in this list, the then president of the Congress, Rahul Gandhi, two senior politicians of the Bharatiya Janata Party who are today ministers, Prahlad Patel and Ashwini Vaishnav, who is in fact the Information and Technology and Communications Minister today. He was then just a businessman when he was targeted in 2017 and 2018. The former election commissioner, Ashok Lavasa, his number was on the list. A number of lawyers, a number of employees of the Supreme Court Registry. We also found the number of a young woman who in 2019 had accused the sitting Chief Justice of India, Ranjan Gogoi, of sexual harassment and of unleashing a vendetta against us. It turned out that this young woman, her husband, her brother-in-law, and other relatives, something like 8 or 9 numbers associated with her were all on the database. And the period roughly coincided with the time that she went public with her allegations against Ranjan Gogoi. So this was a very, very broad range of targets. And the question which, of course, we sought to answer was, who is it who has subjected these broad range of individuals to surveillance? Who deployed Pegasus against them? We wrote to the government of India as part of our Pegasus project, mentioning that we had this database, mentioning that we had done forensics on a number of phones, mentioning that we had identified a number of individuals whose phones appeared to have been targeted and so on, and asking the government of India whether they had any information on this. The PMO directed our inquiry to the Ministry of Information Technology, which replied to us about a day or two before we published on July 18th, broadly denying that any of the people on our list had been subjected to surveillance by the government of India. And then you had the ministry reiterating its claims that all surveillance in India is conducted lawfully, and so on and so forth. In my view, this reply by the government of India is very hard to believe, for the simple reason that this spyware, Pegasus, is only sold by the Israeli company NSO Group to governments. So if we found evidence of Pegasus on a number of phones in India, and we asked the question, who has used Pegasus against these people? We can very confidently say that it is a government somewhere that has targeted these guys. Not some private company, not some private individual, not some criminal syndicate. It is a government or a government agency, because NSO Group exports of Pegasus are vetted by the Israeli government, which grants, the Israeli Ministry of Defense grants an export license. And NSO has said in court depositions in America, because Facebook and WhatsApp have taken NSO to court in America because of the 2019 use of Pegasus against WhatsApp users worldwide that I mentioned. NSO has informed a California court on oath that it only sells Pegasus to governments. So we can say with 100% certainty that the targeting of Prashant Kishore and Mindphone and MK Venu and everybody else was done by a government or a government agency. That's point number one. Point number two, okay, which government? We know that the database contains roughly 1,400 numbers that are in India, and the same client also selected several hundred numbers in Pakistan. So you have to ask which government. One of those numbers, incidentally, as was reported by The Guardian and Le Monde, one of those numbers belonged to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan. So which government has an interest in deploying Pegasus against Indian journalists, Indian political figures, Indian human rights activists, the young woman who accused Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi of sexual harassment, as well as against Imran Khan and targets in Pakistan? Now, over the past week, there was a very interesting judgment from the UK High Court on a matter concerning the use of Pegasus against the former wife of the ruler of Dubai. The ruler of Dubai was going through a messy divorce. His wife, Princess Haya, is in the UK. And our project found that her phone had been targeted with Pegasus. And the UK High Court essentially took that on board. There was a whole full-fledged hearing. The UK court concluded that she was indeed targeted with Pegasus and said, on the basis of who had the greatest interest in Princess Haya, her lawyers, her associates, as well as others who appear to have been targeted, and came to the conclusion that it was most likely the ruler of Dubai and some kind of government agency in Dubai or UAE which used Pegasus. And that it was inconceivable that any other government agency would have had an interest in subjecting such a range of characters to this kind of surveillance over a sustained period. And I think using the same logic, looking at the range of targets, if you ask yourself which government would have an interest in targeting Prashant Kishore, Imran Khan, Ashok Lavasa, journalists in India, businessmen in India, it becomes more than apparent that this is the government of India and some government of India agency which has deployed Pegasus. Now, and this brings me to point number 3. Whenever the government of India is asked in parliament or outside, can you please confirm, have you bought and used Pegasus or not? The government of India refuses to answer that question. Most recently, when the matter of the use of Pegasus against journalists and rights activists and opposition figures was taken to the Supreme Court in the form of a PIL filed by multiple journalist bodies, the Supreme Court asked the government of India, please file an affidavit on this question of have you bought Pegasus or not? And the government of India refused to file an affidavit. So I would say, based on its refusal to answer this question, based on the range of people who have apparently been targeted using Pegasus in India and Pakistan, it's very clear that it is the Modi government which has deployed Pegasus in this fashion. And here I want to add a 4th element of deductive reasoning, which is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi makes a visit to Israel in July 2017. And even though the database of numbers, there are more than 50,000 numbers worldwide, even though this database goes back to 2016, the vast majority of Indian numbers start in the aftermath of Mr. Modi's visit to Israel. So I would say, based on all of these pieces of the puzzle, the answer to the question, which government used Pegasus against the range of targets in India, the Bhima Koregaon people, the Chhattisgarh activists, various lawyers, Supreme Court registrars, journalists, political figures, and so on, the answer to that question has to be the Modi government and its agencies. And here I should say that Citizen Lab, which has looked at the use of servers by the NSO group, has concluded that there are in fact 2 agencies in India which are using Pegasus. One, it says, looks only at targets in India, and the other looks at targets in India and abroad. And this also, I submit, fits the pattern that we have seen in our analysis of the database. Now, the question is, what does this mean? What does the use of Pegasus by the government of India against these range of targets mean for governance and for democracy? Before I answer that question, I want to make one minor observation, which is that on the assumption that I've got it wrong, and that the government of India and its agencies are not the ones who have deployed Pegasus against this range of targets in India. Based on what NSO Group has said, that it only sells Pegasus to governments, the least that you would have expected from the government of India by now is some kind of inquiry to establish which foreign government has obtained Pegasus and is using it in such a way against a range of Indian targets, including ministers, including former head of the CBI, including a former head of the BSF, including a former member of the Election Commission. If it's not the government of India, surely the Modi government, which prides itself on being such an outspoken defender of national security in India, surely the Modi government would have taken steps to establish which government has targeted all these people in India, but it has done nothing of the sort. So I would say inaction on the part of the government to find out whether, in fact, a foreign government, a hostile government has used Pegasus against targets in India is a further element of my deductive reasoning for why the targeting has been done by this government and its agencies. Now let's come to the consequences, as I promised. I began by saying in this lecture that the use of Pegasus is alarming, not simply because it represents an invasion of individual privacy. So it's not just an assault on the privacy rights of a citizen, but it also represents a threat to democracy. And I think this is what I want to emphasize, because when we look at India as a surveillance state, this is not just a question of the Secret Service or politicians indulging their peeping Tom instincts. It's not that they are voyeurs who are anxious to know about our personal secrets. My submission to you is that Pegasus is being used as a weapon to further the political interests of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. Simple. And to support my claim, I offer exhibit number 1, which is the forensic test that we conducted on the smartphone of Prashant Kishore. Prashant Kishore, as you know, was the chief electoral strategist of West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee. The state elections this year were a keenly fought battle where Prime Minister Narendra Modi threw in everything. He personally attended and addressed dozens of meetings and rallies despite COVID, and treated what was a state-level assembly election as some kind of a referendum on his own government. So anxious was he to dislodge Mamata Banerjee. What does it mean that Pegasus was used against Prashant Kishore in the midst of this election? I submit that this represents, at the very least, a violation of the Electoral Code of Conduct. It's a violation of the Representation of People's Act. I believe it constitutes a corrupt practice because public funds in the form of taxpayer money have been used to buy at a very great cost Pegasus from a foreign company, and a government agency has used this spyware purchased with public money on behalf of the private interest of the ruling party in order to understand all the secrets of an opposition strategist and thereby undermine the election campaign of a party that the BJP was trying to defeat. I'm not saying this as surmise, as guesswork, as an allegation. I'm saying this as established fact because we have forensic evidence of the presence of Pegasus on Prashant Kishore's phone during the West Bengal election. We know that Rahul Gandhi also was targeted with Pegasus during the 2019 period, 2018-2019, in the run-up to the 2019 Lok Sabha election and even after. We know that many players, important Congress and Janata Dal secular politicians were targeted with Pegasus in the days and weeks running up to the toppling of the Congress JDS coalition government in Karnataka in 2019. All of this represents acts of corruption, violations of the Prevention of Corruption Act, because public money has been used to deliver personal political gain to those who are in power. Think a minute about what happened in the United States during the Watergate scandal. President Nixon was accused of authorizing a break-in to plant listening devices in a campaign headquarters of the opposition Democratic Party in Washington in the run-up to the 1972 election. This was discovered and investigated much later, but finally Nixon had to quit. We don't know whether Nixon used US taxpayer money to pay for the burglars to go in and try to spy on the Democratic Party. But the very fact that a sitting president could use illegal, unfair surveillance methods on his opposition in the run-up to an election was deemed to be an offense so grave that had Nixon not resigned, he would surely have been impeached. What Narendra Modi has done in 2019 and in 2021 during the West Bengal election is an offense far more grave than Watergate, because you have used Pegasus against Mamata Banerjee's chief advisor in the midst of an election. And you've used public money to do that. You used public agencies. Nobody ever alleged or accused Richard Nixon of using the CIA or the FBI to break into the Watergate building and try to spy on the Democratic Party. Here, the Prime Minister has used intelligence agencies that are part of the government. Very, very grave offense. And one which shows the extent to which the ruling party is prepared to go in order to undermine the electoral prospects of its opposition and ensure that the level playing field that voters expect in an election is disrupted in your favor. Here I should add that it was perhaps not a coincidence that Pegasus also appears to have been used against Ashok Lavasa, who was the one election commissioner in 2019, during the 2019 campaign, who took a stand that several of Prime Minister Modi's speeches, especially the one where he targeted the voters of Wayanad in Kerala on a communal basis, violated the Model Code of Conduct and represented an offense. Ashok Lavasa was, of course, overruled. So the Election Commission decided ultimately in Modi's favor. But it cannot be a coincidence that Ashok Lavasa's name also figures, his number figures also figures in our database of potential targets of the use of Pegasus. So if you look at the kind of targeting, if you look at the timing of the targeting, you see that Narendra Modi is not satisfied with the huge advantage he already enjoys in terms of numbers, in terms of money. I haven't mentioned electoral bonds, which represents a further subversion of the electoral process. But not satisfied with all of these advantages, Mr. Modi goes one step further and deploys spyware that is officially, at least as per the Israeli government's claims and the manufacturer's claims, supposed to be used against terrorists and criminals. And even in court, the Solicitor General was arguing that Pegasus is something which concerns, or surveillance concerns, national security. The way in which Pegasus was used has nothing to do with national security. In the case of Prashant Kishore, in the case of journalists, in the case of human rights activists. But it has everything to do with giving the state, giving the ruling party an advantage over its political rivals. So this use of surveillance to not just invade the personal space of people you don't like, not just to violate the individual's right to privacy, but to actually use information that you gather in order to subvert the democratic process, in order to subvert the electoral process, represents the true danger that Pegasus poses for Indian democracy and India as a whole. Which is why it is vital that the Supreme Court of India, which is currently seized of the matter, get to the bottom of this scandal, assign responsibility, punish those who have violated the law in this fashion. Because unless this is done, unless the ministers and officials who used illegal surveillance means against political rivals of the Bharatiya Janata Party, both in terms of elections, in terms of media, in terms of activism and civil society activism and so on and so forth. Unless this is investigated and the officials and ministers and politicians responsible are punished, we are in a situation where it will become harder and harder to trust in the integrity of the Indian electoral process. Mr. Modi has recently taken to describing India as the mother of all democracies. Frankly, this is a tall claim if you go back in history, because democracy as we know it is of much more recent vintage. And for all the democratic impulses that existed in India in the past, there were plenty of other undemocratic impulses which also existed and which were dominant. Caste oppression, for example, the oppression of women, the oppression of the poor people, going back in history. But leaving the historical aspect of India being the mother of all democracies aside, how can India be the mother of democracy or the father of democracy or the child of democracy if elections can be compromised by a ruling party using Pegasus against its political opponents? This is a question that civil society needs to debate. This is a question that the Supreme Court needs to answer. And based on, we've seen from the UK High Court ruling that no matter what claims are made about national security and so on and so forth, it is possible for judges to develop courtcraft to pierce the veil and get to the bottom of how the spyware is being used. And I believe that it's only if the judiciary ensures full transparency on this matter that Indian democracy in this era of surveillance can be safeguarded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you so much. That's really an elaborate talk on the state of surveillance state. We already have a few questions coming up. We would request you to please be the tell-down session so that we can direct the questions to you. Thank you very much. The second speaker for today is Professor Suryakant Wagmore. Professor Suryakant is a professor at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Bombay. His research includes studying social exclusion, politics at margins, among others, with particular focus on emotions, humor, and anger. Professor Suryakant has authored 3 books published by Routledge and Sage. He had also contributed multiple chapters and papers to multiple books, and he writes regularly for various media outlets. In the contemporary times of seemingly Hindutva hegemony, Professor Suryakant will take us through the intricacies of that in this talk titled Hinduism, Hindutva, and Human Rights. A reminder to type out your questions in the chat box. I'll just translate this into Telugu and you can take it over, Suryakant. ఇప్పుడు మన ప్రొఫెసర్ సూర్యకాంత్ గారు మాట్లాడతారు. ప్రొఫెసర్ సూర్యకాంత్ గారు ఐఐటి బాంబేలో డిపార్ట్మెంట్ ఆఫ్ హ్యూమానిటీస్ అండ్ సోషల్ సైన్సెస్లో ప్రొఫెసరు. ఆయన ముఖ్యంగా సోషల్ ఎక్స్క్లూజన్ మీద, సామాజిక నిర్లక్ష్యం కానీ, సామాజిక అణచివేత, అలాగే మిగతా విషయం మీద ఆయన ఇప్పటి వరకు 3 పుస్తకాలు రాశారు. రోట్లెజ్, సేజ్ లాంటి చాలా ప్రముఖ ప్రచురణ సంస్థలు ఆ పుస్తకాలు ప్రచురించినాయి. అంతేగాక ఆయన చాలా పుస్తకాల్లో ఆయన చాలా అధ్యాయాలు కానీ, అకాడమిక్ పేపర్స్ కానీ రాసుకుంటూ వచ్చారు. దాంతోపాటు చాలా మీడియా హౌసెస్లో ఆయన ఇప్పటికీ వ్యాసాలు రాస్తూ ఉంటారు. ఇప్పుడు మన సమకాలీన సమాజం చూస్తుంటే హిందుత్వ యొక్క ఆధిపత్యం పూర్తి స్థాయిలో ఉన్నట్టు మనకు అనిపిస్తుంది. దాని గురించిన విషయాలన్నీ ప్రొఫెసర్ సూర్యకాంత్ గారు ఇప్పుడు మాట్లాడతారు. మీ అందరికి ఇందాక చెప్పినట్టు మీ అందరికి ఏమన్నా ప్రశ్నలు ఉంటే కనుక వాటిని చాట్ బాక్స్ లో టైప్ చేయండి. తెలుగులో అయినా, ఇంగ్లీష్లో అయినా. ఎవరిని అడుగుతున్నారో ఆ ప్రశ్న వాళ్ళని ఉద్దేశించి టైప్ చేయండి. మనం ఆ ప్రశ్నలు వాళ్ళకి అందజేస్తాం. వాళ్ళు దాని తర్వాత జవాబులు ఇస్తారు. ప్రొఫెసర్ సూర్యకాంత్, ప్లీజ్ టేక్ ఇట్ ఆఫ్ ఫ్రమ్ యూ.
Right. Thank you so much, friends from Human Rights Forum, Professor Mr. Krishna, for having me. It's such a privilege to be part of this conversation and this event where we are all together to remember our great friend Balagopal, who in several ways, rekindled our passion for human rights, especially in South, and his ideas and work remain very important for us. Thanks, Siddharth, for laying out some of the broader questions for us on, especially about the nature of Indian democracy. Some of the major issues that plague our democracy, but do not seem to gather that kind of attention which they really need. In this talk, what I would be doing is looking at the nature of collective ideas and conscience that tend to govern our politics and democracy, and how they construct the very nature of democracy that we are in. As you all know, my talk is titled Hinduism, Hindutva, and Human Rights. What I'll be doing here is looking at the making of more of peace and order in our society, and how religion constitutes a very important aspect of not merely the order, but also it influences our politics and the nature of democracy that we are in. So some of the questions that I'll engage with include, what kind of citizenship does Indian democracy promise to its citizen, and more particularly the marginal groups? What is the nature of collective morals that construct our localized political order? Indian democracy is increasingly understood as an illiberal democracy, and illiberal democracies are not most conducive for the idea of individual freedom or substantive possibilities of universal human rights. I have argued in my previous work that Indian democracy hosts a peculiar form of paradox of high democracy and low civility. Other scholars have emphasized the violent heart. For instance, Thomas Hanson has emphasized the violent heart of Indian politics. Beyond violence, however, the poverty and inequality, coupled with kind of long-lasting peace, which is celebrated in Hindutva political circles also, long-lasting peace and order, can best be understood through the collective ideas, conscience that govern our democracy. So in this talk, I'll briefly talk of two at least, concepts, if you want to call them that, that I have worked on in the past few years, which I call as Hindu politeness and Hindu cosmopolitanism. And I will engage with the question of new Hindutva by revisiting an old conflicting distinction set up by Ashish Nandi between Hindutva and Hinduism. Now, if you leave my talk early, if you are not there, let me quickly tell you that I do not see Hinduism and Hindutva as similar. Rather, I argue that Hindutva, despite its limitation, is a reformist current within the Hindu political forms and movements. Having said that, the paper is organized in kind of three parts. The first part, I would briefly speak on gender. The second part on gender and caste, to highlight the makings of Hindu politeness in rural areas, followed by Hindu cosmopolitanism in cities, and Hindutva finally, and would finally conclude all of this together to maybe reflect on the democracy, our democracy and its state. So let me begin with some memories of my field work. After graduating from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in May 2001, I was living in a village in rural Marathwada as part of my first job with a Brahmin-run NGO. Caste dominates rural life through regulation and control of women. We had learned this in classrooms, but the actual workings of caste and gender in the village were far more educating. One fine day, a drunk man from the local dominant Maratha caste in the village had poured kerosene on his wife before setting her on fire in public view. On the very day, Jadhav, a Maratha male colleague who worked as peon in this NGO, shared this with me. The woman did not survive, and in her statement before death, she told the police that the cause of the burns was a kerosene stove burst. She was concerned about her young children, and the village was largely appreciative of her sacrifice. What did the sacrifice involve? Sparing her husband in the interest of her children. However, she was not merely sparing her husband. She was also sacrificing her life for her caste. In dying a dignified death and by not challenging her husband, she had protected Maratha honor and masculinity of her husband. Jadhav, who shared this with me, was a good man and had some remorse of what had happened in the village. He was keenly interested in education of his school-going son and daughter. In the NGO, he was seen as a brainless fellow who everyone, especially men, made fun of. Jadhav, however, was not a lame duck, as other men of power thought of him. He was, in his words, he would describe to me himself as Krishna. The NGO used to encourage widowed women to work and live on its premises. And Jadhav had a love affair with who he thought as the most sought after woman. And she also happened to be a Brahmin, who was a graduate and worked as an accountant. A secret that no one knew other than me. Jadhav was a good keep for the Brahmin widow, as no one would doubt him due to his innocence and illiteracy that surrounded his personality. There were times, these were times when internet was new. Jadhav's interest in sex knew no bounds, and Jadhav's interest in sex knew no bounds. He told me that the only computer in which which had internet, and those were the days when internet was with modem, and you know how it used to work, right? With passwords and so on. So he told me that the only computer which had internet in the office had some pornography, and he would like to see it. But the access to this computer was limited to an engineer from Mali caste, who was a key confidant of the Brahmin family that owned the NGO. Jadhav told me that the Mali engineer also had an affair with another woman from the Chamar caste, and both of them watched porn together. I did not believe him initially, as 2 cases of intercaste sexual affair almost made caste seem dysfunctional in this organizational space. It was some kind of post-caste space. However, as I had occasional access to this precious computer, Jadhav made me hunt down the file. That was the file Jadhav had. That was the first time Jadhav had seen pornography on a computer, and also maybe oral sex as well. The very next day, he had used his newly learned skill on his lover and wouldn't stop bragging about amazing results. When I asked him, was sex not satisfying at home? Why this adventure outside? He would tell me that his wife was generally too tired after working on the farm whole day, and she was fine with him doing his little thing outside. He took me to his house for lunch one day. We are friends. And on a return asked me, isn't she beautiful? But she's not interested in sex. Don't you see how tired she is? He said. Jadhav, a small farmer who faced the vagaries of droughts and topped up his income with this volatile kind of job in the NGO, was neither into alcohol nor wife beating. But the wife knew her place. Both the bad, the murderer, if you want to call him, and the good husband came with some sacrificial costs, and most often the cost involved giving up substantial freedoms for women. In this tale of 3 women, one who was burned to death, the other who would let her husband have some sexual adventures and other whatever adventures outside, and an educated woman who could not remarry despite her education and income, is the normalized story of unfreedom of women in rural India. Their unfreedom is seen not only in prohibition of adventure, but also in them taking solace in the adventurous life of men. Perhaps the educated Brahmin woman had some advantage because of her education, but every move of hers was watched in the NGO and outside. The societal surveillance of her life was much more due to her being single and economically independent. She was abnormal for the village life, and her widowhood with no children made it worse. A single and economically independent woman is an abnormal exception for village life, as woman only needs to be dependent on family, husband, father, son, brother, for security and income. She also needs to be domesticated. Rarely would you find drunk women behaving like men in the village. Women continue to be the izzat of family, and families hold on to izzat so as to sustain the respect of family and caste. The woman who was lit on fire in public view in one way was property of caste, and no one therefore recognized the human personality of hers. Justice was not about her rights. It was about the honor of caste and the bad name that her death could bring to her family and caste. The death, not murder, had to be hushed up and forgotten, erased from public memory. What was worse was the woman, even before dying, took solace in letting her husband live with dignity and freedom. Such sexual and economic control of women is at the heart of caste hierarchy and Hindu solidarity in rural areas, and also in urban areas too. A Hindu is not a Hindu because he accepts certain principles or philosophies, suggests Hinal Shah. He is a Hindu because he is a member of a caste. In my work on the larger paper, longer paper on Hindu politeness, you'll see that how even Maratha women gang up to attack, ex-untouchable caste women when it comes to caste power. So, caste becomes like a family, and despite the gendered nature of inequalities within caste, there is a lot of solidarity of men and women within caste across groups, but especially within dominant caste when it comes to attacking the untouchable caste. So having looked at some bit of the gendered nature of it, what we also need to look at beyond violence that takes against women or against the ex-untouchable caste, we also need to look at Hindu, what I call is Hindu politeness, where violence is not something that governs caste violence, is not something that governs rural life. Right? So recurring cases of caste violence, especially against scheduled caste in rural India, bring to the fore the fragile nature of rural peace. As part of my research on caste power and Ambedkarization in rural Marathwada, I have observed the dynamics of caste and role of violence in shaping and reshaping caste relations. One finds it difficult to make arguments like caste is over, that village culture is withering due to labor mobility or exodus, and diminishing returns in agriculture. In villages, both culture and dominance have withstood, interacted, and evolved with increased urbanization, albeit with definite and visible changes in cultural and political order. Besides caste violence, one therefore needs to understand rural peace, cross-caste friendship, political alliances, and the hidden or suppressed humanity of dominant caste who indulge in violence against ex-untouchable caste. By dominant caste, I mean the caste that is numerically significant and controls land ownership and also usually claims the role of village heads or kingly roles. While it is mostly the middle caste like Lingayats, Vakaligas, Maratha, Kunbi, Patidars, Kammas, Reddys, Jats, and Thevas or Gaundars who resort to violence as political communication, it is the local material and cultural conditions that construct both violence and peace. In villages where ex-untouchable castes outnumber dominant groups, instances of caste violence are rare. The newer form of social and political accommodation of marginal castes in rural society cannot be ignored. Castes are not always at war in villages, nor do ex-untouchable castes face physical violence every day. Caste power also operates through peace and politeness. Why is it important to think of politeness? What I suggest in my own work is politeness, a new form of political behavior that is learned by caste subjects. So how does one make sense of equality even if you don't believe in equality? A few days back we had an official email, for instance, saying that how do you respond to students? So you have to use language that does not offend anyone, right? Otherwise someone may file a case against you. Right? No, this is politeness. You may not mean it, but you practice it, right? And this is need, because you don't want to get any legal trouble. And I use this in understanding behavior of caste subjects in villages, right? How even if you are a dominant caste, how does one make meaning of equality without believing in it? Right. So idea of Hindu politeness is useful in deciphering the fragile nature of rural peace in villages. Hindu politeness helps us understand newer Hindu solidarity beyond caste in villages. These are embedded in power, but also involve continued acculturation where castes not considered pure claim purity and simultaneously attempting to become Hindus, to become authentic Hindus. For instance, regularly we have these cases of non-SC/ST caste dominant groups protesting against this SC/ST Atrocities Act. Now, as you know, the rate of conviction in Atrocities Act is very poor. The nature of state, the structure of state ensures that there are no convictions. And most of the times, even the cases are not registered because the castes that are affected and untouchable castes may not necessarily have the kind of local power on police and so on. So despite that, there is a lot of protest. And increasingly what we see is, for instance, in Maharashtra, the protest is by the OBC caste and the dominant caste, Maratha caste. So what we see here is this making of Hindu unity, solidarity, which does not necessarily include the ex-untouchable caste, may not also exclude them totally, but there is a solidarity that is of various forms. One is maybe political at times against the Atrocities Act, but there is also, for instance, these are These are embedded in power, but also involve continued acculturation, where castes not considered pure claim purity and simultaneously become authentic Hindus. There are villages with minimal and no presence. These are villages with minimal or no presence of Brahmins. Religion, however, is the critical sphere of solidarity. Babas, gurus, saptas help promote purity and solidarity. Along with village temples, regular religious gatherings, besides being sites of power operations, are therefore also places of cohesion. In these processes of universalization of purity, ex-untouchable castes are not always equal participants, but are not totally excluded either. Elections provide occasions to also form cross-caste political solidarity, with money and liquor constituting the axis of mobilization and celebration. Hindu politeness also means birth of a new civilized Hindu subject. Now, mind you, here Hindutva has, not every Hindu is aligned with Hindutva, and this merger is doesn't really, I mean, it's misplaced. The popular workings of Hinduism require also, I mean, given the fact that caste dominates and governs the Hindu public life beyond state, it also requires modification of this caste subject. So Hindu politeness meant birth of a new civilized Hindu subject that provided, or at least in principle agreed to, some dignity and equality to ex-untouchable castes in village public life. Though this courtesy was not necessarily extended to women, right? So the making of Hindu politeness is also a product of fully Ambedkarite movements and their resorting the use of SC/ST Atrocities Act with of course individualized struggles against caste discrimination as well. Also with caste rudeness of the earlier form that normalized disgust and violence towards untouchables decreasing, especially amongst non-dominant castes, the making of a new compassionate rural Hindu cannot be ruled out. For dominant castes like Marathas, however, it was most difficult to make peace with the idea of ex-untouchable castes or even nomadic tribes and lower OBCs as equal village citizens. This is because of their feudal selfhood, which is predicated upon the docility of marginal castes in village social life. A lot of violence in my own fieldwork, which I have written on in rural Marathwada against ex-untouchable caste, is also linked to them continually pushing the boundaries of Hindu politeness, claiming power in local panchayats, encroaching and cultivating Gairan lines, claiming dignity, or worse, being in love with dominant caste girl. Historically, the struggle over politics and performance of newer icons of emancipation like Ambedkar in public spaces has both led to violence and democratized public spaces as well. Thus, constructing a newer Hindu subject who tolerates some form of formal equality in public spaces. Now, so broadly, Hindu politeness is thus new subjectivity of rural dominance. Caste is not erased here. One continues to be a caste self, but a new form of politeness governs cross-caste relations, which wields caste and more particularly disgust towards untouchables. Such politeness creates a mirage of rural peace and equality, only to turn violent as soon as ex-untouchable caste make newer economic, cultural, or political claims. The violence can polarize caste, pushing village peace and Hindu politeness into the abyss. And even those within dominant castes sympathetic to the sufferings of marginal caste groups would turn into caste-specific subjects and warriors. So when there is polarization, even if you understand that you may be in the wrong place, you become a caste. Empathy is not a normal sentiment in that sense. Hindu politeness may thus be at odds with genuine civility and substantive rural equality, but it syncs well with democracy of procedure and patronage, where constructing a newer rural Hindu solidarity based on temporal peace and adverse accommodation of marginal castes. We may continue to celebrate procedural democracy. Right? So this is why I say we have democracy without civility. Right? So we may continue to celebrate procedural democracy and cultural solidarity in rural India, but the problem of incivility thrives. So broadly, having spoken of Hindu politeness, let me move on to Hindu cosmopolitanism. And this from the rural, one is also moving to urban. Now, this study was about caste associations. I will kind of run through this. I'm not going to present any empirical work here. but just a brief kind of conceptual review and argument. So a critical review, for instance, of cosmopolitanism in contemporary times could be broadly understood as an elitist, Western, bourgeois, and liberal project that provides moral and political meaning to lives of the present-day privileged elites who cross national boundaries across the East and West with ease. Cosmopolitanism, however, has deeper historical roots with meanings and implications. For Stoic philosophers, a lack of reason amongst humans was tantamount to slavery, and use of reason alone would lead us into being citizens of the world. Neither status nor states could impinge upon our natural inclination towards cosmopolitanism. For socialist writers, likewise, cosmopolitanism was linked to bourgeois and Enlightenment ideas of humanism. In my work, I draw from Hall, Calhoun, Pollock, and Chatterjee to resist the top-down models of studying and understanding cosmopolitanism as an extension of liberal ideas of global citizenship. I contribute to the diverse version of cosmopolitanism that is soaked in local ethics, politics, and urbanism of the East. One natural place to look for cosmopolitanism is in cities and urban spaces as sites of openness and accommodation, where coexistence of varied cultures, races, classes was both possible and necessary. How did cosmopolitanism configure and consolidate in cities of non-Western world? City life could be seen as an ideal place for practicing the ethics of alterity based on the centrality of free-flowing dialogue, not guided by instrumental reasoning central to modernity or communal bonds tied to traditionalism, thus producing a sociability through spontaneity and impulse which is artistic, free-flowing, and based on pure humanity. I'm drawing from Zimmel here. Perhaps for this reason, Dr. Ambedkar called for ex-untouchables to leave the villages for cities, as caste constructed a deeper challenge to the possibilities of local cosmopolitanism and civility in rural life. For subaltern, cities constitute spaces of emancipation from the tyranny of rural social order. Urban margins could also construct subaltern cosmopolitanism as politics from below. Others have argued this. To explore the multiple meanings and possibilities of urban cosmopolitanism, we may also need to look at cosmopolitanism beyond the compulsions and hard lives of poor and exploited populations. Right? So my research has examined the meaning of city spaces for communities considered higher and pure caste in contemporary times. As part of a larger project funded by ICSR on withering caste in urban locales, I also studied caste associations of pure and privileged in Mumbai to understand how they negotiate and construct cosmopolitan urbanism. Are these caste associations anti-cosmopolitan? Do they promote a different form of cosmopolitanism? Caste in its plasticity took the form of guilds and trade unions with urbanization and industrialization. Caste in Bombay thrived under the British as the colonial government maintained their policy of non-interference in indigenous religion. Bombay saw reorientation of primordial groups, caste and religious sects, as a response to ideological and political changes, and a new form of urban leadership developed that had primordial linkages like caste. Caste groups who had better jobs used ties of caste and kinship to fill future job openings and solidify their position. The flip side of this is that caste also influences economic inequalities and exclusion in labor markets. Caste has also historically shaped the organization of residential spaces, especially in villages, and also continues to do so in contemporary urban India. So, could the presence of caste, right, meaning caste is of course there in cities, but could the presence of caste as community in cities also point to traditional urbanism and structural continuity between rural and urban? Does caste as community also provide social and moral base for urban life worlds and cosmopolitanism in India? So I explored this through study of caste associations, right? Several caste associations, their virtual form and interviews and group discussion. Right? So drawing on this research, I argued that cosmopolitanism, while being necessity of life in a megacity, drawing on this research, I argue that cosmopolitanism, while being a necessity of life in a metropolis, results from the compulsion as well as seductions that accompany life in a megacity. The political and economic consequences of absolute segmentation are tremendous in modern times, as they can freeze technical innovation and perpetuate the ritualized tyranny of cousins. This is Gellner, right? As a community, caste as community is presented as a social solidarity of choice by caste associations in cities. So it's almost as if caste is a choice, when you form this association, which is not. To enable individuals negotiate urbanism and indulge in consumptive soft cosmopolitanism. Some interventions of caste associations may seem anti-cosmopolitan, as they mostly encourage horizontal alterity, right? So, for instance, some caste associations had, if you are a bunt, one could organize Mr. and Mrs. Bunt. So the idea is, that younger people meet at these places and also fall in love. So there is alterity, but the idea it's horizontal. It's with people of your own kind. So I suggest, however, that cosmopolitanism should not necessarily be judged through parameters of inclusion alone, since some exclusion may well be part of Hindu cosmopolitanism that drives post-colonial urbanism in India. So we did Hindu politeness, so Hindu cosmopolitanism, by looking at this privileged and pure castes and their collective morals through caste associations, right? One could argue that there is something called Hindu cosmopolitanism, right? And this category can help us understand the nature of collective self, with also individualist inclinations, right? Of consumption, of materialism, right? So caste associations try to provide roots to freely moving individuality and alterity in a non-violent form, right? It's not like one would have shared examples in villages, right? So its caste is given more as a choice, like I said. Such regulation is not absolute closure and is in keeping with ideas of coexistence of diverse communities. In latent forms, however, caste associations try to dissuade those who may want to move beyond caste for love, sympathy, and compassion. Caste associations are thus contra dialogue and alterity, right? Also against alterity, as they affect the possibilities of reciprocity, spontaneity, and free-flowing sociality in the city. Strategies used by these caste associations encompass both material and cultural spheres. For the caste associations of the privileged, the city holds no promise of liberation and equality. City, some respondents said that city is Kali Yuga, the golden age of caste as community is lost or is seen as eroding radically. Caste associations work towards forming a newer urban identity from within caste groups, thus working towards the difficult task of holding together the inner solidarity of very jati itself in ethical ways under the rubric of Hindu cosmopolitanism. They thus aid in constructing soft cosmopolitanism that downplays alterity and helps negotiate moral density of urban spaces. So very much as opposed to Durkheim's organic solidarity that privileges solidarity of individuals, caste as community continues to provide a foundational basis for cosmopolitan urbanism and Hindu cosmopolitanism. Now, while one needs to understand this form of individualist and consumptive, very modern urban life from the point of view of this caste subject, one also needs to recognize that there are problems. And the major problem I'm suggesting is it's void of alterity. Rather, Hindu cosmopolitanism points to the impossibility of alterity. So the Hindu cosmopolitanism of caste associations points both to the limits of liberal cosmopolitanism as an ideal and the lack of alterity as a necessity in urban publics that Hindu cosmopolitans seek to constitute. Hindu cosmopolitans too claim to host critical cosmopolitanism in their moves to challenge westernized ways of individualism, to retain community at the heart of urban indulgence. They, however, obstruct spontaneity, sociability, and genuine alterity that make a dialogical community possible. Right? So this is the vulgar part of it. Now, having spoken briefly about politeness, and cosmopolitanism broadly as rural and urban forms of changing subjecthood. Let me come to Hindutva. Now, this project, again, this study is based on study of, I was just lucky to, do the study of this very important organization, which is part of RSS called Rashtrattana. And the nature of voluntarism and the kind of work they do, as every sociologist and political scientist who has worked on RSS knows, is impressive. So what I do here is some conceptual work, first of all, on distinguishing Hinduism and Hindutva. And then come back to this question of what is the nature of democracy and where we are, why we are here, if at all I'm able to engage with that question broadly before I end. So, so going back to this distinction that Nandi had set up for us. So while Nandi hoped for an end of Hindutva at the hands of Hinduism, the former has not only survived, but also grown leaps and bounds. A foundational problem with those who place faith in Hinduism for fighting Hindutva is their overlooking of caste question. I approach new Hindutva by locating caste at the center of popular Hinduism and thereby distinguishing it from Hindutva. Hindutva has historically pursued a nationalist critique of caste and has thus been part of Hindu modernizing or reform processes. Contemporary forms of engagement with the caste in Hindutva's ideology building unravel the making of Hinduism as a civil religion. Now, here is the distinction that I set, right? The popular Hinduism, I mean, for instance, this fellow who is, going to set wife on fire in public, nothing to do with Hindutva. Right. I locate at, I suggest that Hindutva is, you have to look at it as part of a reform process. Right. I mean, some of you may immediately pounce at me saying that, what about the anti-Muslim sentiment and all. I mean, that is a secondary problem. Right now, what is important when you look at caste is what is the nature of newer solidarity and what is the possibility of equality that is created. And there are several criticisms of reform movements that we have had in the past, we may have of Hindutva also, but it is very important to look at what is this collective nature of, what is this nature of solidarity that Hindutva sets up and what does it promise? So what I'm suggesting is that it promises to turn Hinduism into civil religion, right? So while caste is weakening, it continues to substantially define the selfhood of most Hindus in rural and urban India. Anti-caste discourse is all pervasive in the movements that mobilize around fully Ambedkarite ideology or the imagined Bahujan collective that is used. It is everywhere, right? In these movements, even left movements are now setting foot into anti-caste politics. Hindu nationalists engage with the problem of caste by resorting to a discourse and politics of Hindu unity and humanism across caste. I delve into the politics of inclusion by broad-basing, I delve into the politics of inclusion and broad-basing in Hindutva by focusing on this organization that I mentioned and their important educational initiatives in Karnataka. And one of their important work has been to identify poor boys aspiring to study and brilliant boys aspiring to study at IITs. So what they are doing is they're providing them coaching, and coaching in a cultural form. It's almost like the old form of Gurukul being reinvented, right? But whereas it's in keeping with modern times. So RSS is denied status of an association. For instance, Rudolph, when she wrote in 2000, she suggested that RSS cannot constitute civil society as it fails to generate social capital for democracy. But that has one of the central arguments I have been making is that one could have democracy without civility, and that's the nature of Indian democracy. So this whole hard work of putting RSS as not good for generating social capital at times is misplaced. So following Rudolph may make RSS appear as a form of uncivil solidarity in the civil sphere. RSS is nevertheless an association, and I pursue Hansen, who refers to RSS and affiliate institutions as alternate civil society. I developed this idea of alternate civil society further to explore contemporary universal claims and dimensions of ideology building in RSS, more particularly the makings of Hinduism as a civil religion. Complementing studies that attribute the social service of the RSS to expanding base of BJP, I suggest that interventions, educational initiatives and interventions, newer ones of RSS, more particularly work towards turning Hinduism into a civil religion. While such an attempt cannot be claimed to be a new phenomena, changing political and economic conditions, along with newer moral and social interventions in civil sphere, demand construction of Hindu religion as a civil religion. What does civil religion mean? The idea of equality is at the heart of it. You may draw from traditional resources or reservoirs, but this whole form of a civil collective is something new. So religion here is fused with nationalism to produce a nationalist Hindu, a higher and better being than the one driven by popular Hinduism of caste. Such a process has meant constructing Hinduism as a civil religion fit for governance and politics in the interest of Hindus, but not void of modern and futuristic ideas and possibilities of equality. Both the past and present are innovatively constructed so as to build a nationalist Hinduism that undermines and even criticizes caste distinction and inequality. By strategically undermining caste and simultaneously calling for compassion within Hindus. This is rare. This is what if you look at my previous work, right? Even if dominant caste person had sympathy, right, that or empathy towards the person who was violated by dominant caste, like, of a not pure and unacceptable caste, that concern had to be suppressed, right? But here that is being turned into a collective sentiment, right? Newer. So by strategically undermining caste and simultaneously calling for compassion within Hindus, Hindutva mobilizes towards forming solidarity around nationalistic Hinduism based on the ideals of Seva. Hindutva thus succumbs to the pressures of varied progressive civil currents and responds by co-opting and inventing hybrid forms of social interventions to consolidate Hinduism as a civil religion. So, right, I'm sorry, can you please tell me how much time I have? How much more time I have?
Yeah, Professor, I mean, you have some more time. Yeah, you have some more time, please continue.
No, in the sense, then I will decide whether to go into empirical material or just speak conceptually. So say 10 minutes?
Yeah, Professor. 10, 15 minutes.
10 minutes. All right. So let me just briefly then, on 15th August 2018, Mohan Bhagwat visited an English medium school run by Rashtrottana in Bengaluru, where Tapas is also located, this important coaching school. As a chief guest for Independence Day celebrations, he unfurled the national flag and called for responsibility, sacrifice, world progress, and peace, evoking ideas from Buddha and preamble of Indian Constitution. This was in line with Mohan Bhagwat's Vijayadashmi speech in 2015 in Nagpur, where a new dharma, right? Not new, but a dharma was evoked with universal claims based on diverse but certain essential elements of seva and compassion. This included recognition of caste discrimination and Ambedkar's politics of compassion. I quote, in Guruji's, Guruji, second chief of RSS, in Guruji's words, Ambedkar's talent was a confluence of Acharya Shankar's sharp intellect and Tathagat Buddha's unbounded compassion. Let us all unite. Let us all Hindus unite. Do not compromise with any discrimination. Let us set an example of human brotherhood to the world afflicted by sorrow. Ambedkar, however, is depoliticized and peripheral in the praxis of RSS. Caste is not frequently mentioned as an great ethical past, and discrimination on its basis is increasingly recognized as a problem to be dealt with. As Ambedkarite and Mandal movements revolve around the repertoire of caste as structural inequality, Hindutva constructs Hinduism as a civil religion, not necessarily bound by caste anymore, but as a step towards mobilizing various castes in favor of nationalist Hinduism. One of the important scholars of civil religion, Robert Bellah, would suggest that civil religion need not impinge on private religion. It is not always invoked in favor of worthy causes also. Bellah used the idea of American civil religion to refer to a set of beliefs, symbols, and rituals that exist alongside of rather than clearly differentiated from the churches. And I quote, the American civil religion was never anti-clerical or militantly secular. It borrowed selectively from religious traditions in such a way that the average American saw no conflict between the two. In this way, civil religion was able to build up without any bitter struggle with the church, powerful symbols. In this way, civil religion was able to build up without any bitter struggle with the church's powerful symbols of national solidarity and to mobilize deep levels of personal motivation for attainment of national goals. A recent attempt to recover civil religion in contemporary times is made by Phil Gorski. For him, the enemies of civil religion lay in religious nationalism and liberal secularism. He calls for rescuing civil religion, which could help arrive at a balance between pluralism and solidarity. Excessive solidarity on racial and national basis leads to fragmentation for him, but civil religion could bring together realism and hope, which for Gorski is a theological and civil virtue. Both Bellah and Gorski bend towards a positive reading of civil religion. And Gorski in particular carves out neat compartments of religious nationalism and liberal secularism as those opposed to civil religion. In public life, however, there may be a wide spectrum of civil religion, from worthy causes to regressive social closure, symbols and rituals, state and non-state, and its usage by competing groups in competing forms for a sustained inner consolidation within a particular ethnic or religious group. In religiously plural democracies, civil religion may hold the illusory promise of equality for in-group and civility of indifference and even violence to those outside. Right? So one is not undermining the violence it may generate outside, right? But there is also in-group equality. And this bit of in-group inequality is something that is not part of the popular religion. Right? So now let's turn to the question of Hinduism versus Hindutva. While Hinduism in its popular practice lacks universal salvation philosophy of solidarity and may seem more like a collection of castes that occasionally unite for political purposes and ritual purposes or for rites, Hindutva seeks to actively unite the divided and hierarchically ordered castes under the rubric of Hindu unity. The fear of other Muslims and Christians mostly dominates the repertoires of such mobilization, along with cow protection and localized communal conflicts. A sustained cultural and economic intervention with marginal groups like Adivasis too has been important strategies, other scholars have suggested. While gaining votes and trust of marginal groups is the motivation, Hindutva increasingly seeks to make newer and deeper social unity across castes, advocating an ethic of equality and universal brotherhood at the same time. Broadly, civil religion helps us locate the rooted virtues and morals beyond the private form of religion in the sphere of politics. The division of religion and politics is a misnomer in India, as the state and society continually intersect, and the polity does reflect the ethos of upper caste Hindus. While liberal and post-colonial critics of Hindutva place hope in Hinduism for outdoing Hindutva, we may gain more analytically by framing Hinduism of Hindutva as a national civil religion. The Nehruvian legacy founded national solidarity on secularism, while the actual democratic practice remained embedded in ethnic relations. Secularism was based on certain conventions of civil speech and restraint in the interaction between communities and religious formations. in some ways, a colonial mode of management of difference got elevated into state ideology, suggests Hansen. The RSS, skip this. So what is happening here, and let me broadly kind of summarize this for you. What we need to understand is that this new form of Hindu subject beyond caste, right, and the way it accommodates, especially tries to accommodate untouchable caste, especially tries to accommodate the Shudra caste, the OBCs, successfully, is something that one needs to understand. Let me just quote, some of the students who study here, right? And none of these are Brahmins; these are middle caste, dominant caste, or OBCs, right? So one student would say, and you should try and get the emotion of this hard work and the achievement of this hard work, right? So one student would share, while studying here, singing Vande Mataram makes me feel very patriotic. It makes a shiver run down my body. I feel immense source of happiness and pride when I sing it. I am so happy to be here because it helps me love my country more than I could till now. Now, what we see here is how culture, education, and aspiration for higher life, in the sense, engineering, IITs may go abroad. All of this is brought together to create and construct this new subject is very important. So what I call this is the sublated Hinduism, right? Or this new form of Hinduism, from Hinduism of caste to Hinduism as a civil religion. Now, sublation in Hegelian dialectic is both negation and preservation of an earlier form, and it is neither synthesis nor irony. The evolving of Hinduism into civil religion in Hindutva discourses is thus part of the dialectic within Hinduism. As suggested earlier, citizenship discourses and anti-caste politics in Phule Ambedkarite movements frame Hinduism of caste as one opposed to freedom, citizenship rights of marginal groups, and this discourse has now spread from southwest to northwest as well. The making of Hinduism into civil religion in Hindutva discourse is thus a necessity both for local politics and global cosmopolitan claims. Let me again quote one of the students who studied here and is an engineer now, studying engineering now, who I suggest experienced this, sublated Hinduism while he studied this. His parents used to run a provision store and used to stay, OBC student, right? Used to stay in a rented house in Bengaluru. He could not get admission in any of the IITs. He now studies in one of the regional engineering colleges. He continues to carry the spirit of Hindu unity and equality with him. Influenced by ideological and cultural education he gained at this coaching center, he is critical of caste divisions and conflict in Karnataka. He comes from the Vanikula Kshatriya caste, which is listed as OBC in Karnataka. Besides coaching for IIT at this coaching center, what he said was he learned the greatness of Indian Sanskriti culture that has been lost over years, making India insignificant power in the world, right? How India was great and it lost its power in the last 400, 500 years. The projection of past, though invented, does not make this invention less effective. Especially if there are students who are listening and who are less influenced by rhetorics of revolution, one needs to give more value in understanding how this subject is created, right? How this passion is invoked and is sustained, right? So the projection of past, though invented, does not make this invention less effective. Rather, the invented version is tailored to present day needs and sensibilities. So this boy would go on to share. Outside there is caste, right? Not inside, not in this collective that we have of RSS, right? A progressive Hindu collective. Outside there is caste, something that we need to counter. He distinguishes popular Hindu religion outside from the civil form of Hindu religion he learned at RSS. This Hinduism is different from the one he grew up with at home. While most rituals and festivals match, the earlier form of Hinduism was without any consciousness for him. He'll explain. Our calendar is Panchanga. Our calendar is Panchanga. Sanskriti is the right path, and the main motto of Shakhas was unity. The making of a now this was a caste subject, right? It was OBC, right? There was an idea of inequality, right? However, the making of a non-caste Hindu self and its unity with Hindu nation, past and present, points to a new form of sublated Hindu consciousness tied to neither caste nor individualist orientations. Such Hindu consciousness also counters the alienation that caste may bring, especially for caste considered marginal and lower. Right? So the student hopes to join politics and correct the wrongs in future. Let me quote again. What B.R. Ambedkar had thought, and what are we doing? Politics is a selfish act. Politicians have ignored droughts in Karnataka. Only Narendra Modi is working for 18 hours. We need the youth force, but they are distracted. We need to fill patriotism in each of them. Right? I will work for 5-6 years in the IT sector and I hope to join politics. Right? Now, his nationalist Hinduism is not purely Brahminic. One should also remember this. Now, RSS is strategically allowing some de-Brahminization, and which is the inclusive form of it, right? That's why we see so many non-Brahmins become active part of RSS. So RSS is strategically allowing some de-Brahminization as part of the project of building Hinduism as civil religion. For instance, when he was at this almost Gurukul, right, the food was vegetarian, and one of the main complaints that he had was he did not really like the food. Right, he's fond of meat, something that was not allowed during his 2 years of residence. Occasionally, when he stepped out to meet his parents, he would enjoy his favorite meals. Right. Now, in no way was he banned for eating meat forever. Right. So this is the new form of possibilities here. So what we see is in everyday functioning of these organizations, the hierarchy of caste is replaced with the hierarchy of respect, seniority, and submission to authority within the movement and the historical narrative it is based on. None of the present students that we interviewed who studied there complained of caste discrimination or along caste lines. Right? This is decidedly different from popular Hinduism. Such a version of inclusion is indeed not egalitarianism. It is rather an alternative version of hierarchy that promises a reversal of estrangement embedded for non-pure castes in popular Hinduism. Right. So it is here that I go on in the paper to talk of how English has become acceptable now. Right. How there is something called Hindu Manushyata, which is evoked, right, and used to to construct this Hindu collective. So before I end, I would like to kind of reach out to a very conservative scholar, someone like Durkheim, for instance, who had a lot of belief in modernity. And for him, one of the distinguishing features of modernity was it made progressive emancipation of individual possible, and the grip of traditional influence on our life would decrease over time, was the hope, right? And so we would evolve into this cult of individual, and we'll have possibly this religion of humanity. And religion was also a major expression of dealing with this process of change. For him, religion would help us reconcile the competing demands of individuals for freedom with the demands and interests of society. Right? Now, what we need to understand is that the constructive role played by organizations like RSS and how they work towards imagining Hinduism as civility. And it's in the longer version of paper, I talk about how they don't talk of caste. Caste is always there, but there is a way around caste. Right? So and the newer forms of inclusion. So this alternate civil society now that they construct now almost intersects with the mainstream liberal and secular civil society occasionally, and there is a discourse which can almost translate this mode of civil religion into an acceptable secular form or liberal form. So Hinduism as a civil religion here is a nationalized religion, one where the territory of India and a thin and abstracted notion of Hinduism are merged to create a new common space that can mediate between localized communities of sects and castes. The initiatives of RSS are also form of civil projects in keeping with the educational demands and desires of younger generations, while keeping them locked in culture of this new civil religion. Students learn to cross boundaries of caste and embody a spirit with marked rituals and practices of nationalist Hinduism. Hinduism is learned as an accommodative and civil religion for all Hindus, and Hindu Manushata is evoked to counter westernization and internal divisions. Having said this, the making of Hinduism as a civil religion also points to new Hindu consciousness amongst lower and middle castes, which counters the estrangement popular Hinduism creates amongst these castes. While liberal Hindus hope to use Hinduism to counter Hindutva, Hindutva is slowly countering the ills of Hindu religion by framing and promoting Hinduism as a national civil religion. Caste, however, is not just localized, but integral to metaphysics of Hinduism. And Hinduism as a civil religion continues to find it difficult to overcome caste. And so here's again a kind of brief summary of what I did here to suggest that there is no Hindu without caste, and there is limited possibility of gender equality, especially in villages, because the whole subjecthood is revolving around caste subject. Now, so while that is like the absolute violation of rights, you see it in violent forms, but it's banal, it's daily. What we also see is intercaste relations are changing. There's a new solidarity which is emerging where there's no violence, where inequality becomes normal, right? And I talked of that as Hindu politeness. Hindu cosmopolitanism in cities where you are educated, you are going all around the world, still rooted in caste. And what we need to understand is that while the new religion that Hindutva works towards is different, there's a lot of hard work that RSS and the Hindutva organizations put towards making Hinduism into civil religion. And despite its limited understanding of nation as one belongs to Hindus, there's a lot of internal churning that it works on simultaneously, which also needs to be understood. But of course, like I said, caste is almost like it's integral to the metaphysics of Hinduism. So neither is it going to be easy for RSS or the Hindutva organizations to overcome, because it is very much the collective conscience of at least in the caste world of Hinduism that governs democracy, right? So that's therefore substantive interest in ideas of equality, ideas of justice is something that continues to be missing in our democracy. So thank you so much for letting me speak at this occasion, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Suryakant. It's really an elaborate, complex talk. I think perhaps it'd like some time for people to wrap their head around, touch upon many issues. Thank you very much. And we have really quite a few questions for both the speakers. We have so many questions here. We have nearly 20 questions for both the speakers together. So I'll go by each question, addressing the respective speaker. Yeah, just give me a second. So, yeah, this question is for Siddharth. Do we have any idea how much one has to pay for one-time purchase of the spyware that is to use against one individual? Followed by, does it recruit vendors? Does it require vendor support for operating the spyware after having been purchased? And if so, how much?
I believe, the contracts are secret, so we don't know exactly what Government of India's agencies have contracted for. But based on deals between NSO and Mexico and NSO and Ghana, some details of that are available. So it seems that the cost is anywhere from $20,000 to $25,000 per number targeted. It's not cheap at all, and they come also with limits to how many numbers can be simultaneously targeted at one time, and so on and so forth. My understanding of the way Pegasus works is that you have a server which is installed in the premises of the purchasing agency, but it requires continuous vendor support and so-called updating and problem solving. So NSO as a vendor seems to have an ongoing relationship with its customers. This seems to be my impression. So that they, even though the company denies having any visibility about how the spyware is used, but there are good reasons to doubt even that claim of the company. And certainly in the California court where NSO is being tried, the judge has disbelieved NSO's claim that it has no power over how the spyware is used by its customers.
Sorry, the above question is by Yasse. Sorry, I forgot to mention the name. And this is a question for Professor Surya. There is this question is by Pawan. There is the usual argument that reservations destroy merit, but in the long run, reservations enriches overall talent pool. How do we convince Savarnas of this logic? And also that it will ensure that the wet dreams of becoming Vishwaguru.
Yeah, I'm not very sure how this, because how is this linked to my paper? I mean, I can just speak on reservations and how they are important. See, reservations, when they came in, it was not about convincing the Savarnas, right? That's why it was forced top down. So that if they are not convinced also, it's okay. There is no need to convince anyone, right? I think presently we are facing the challenge of implementing reservations. So many positions in IITs are vacant. So whether Savarnas are convinced or not, I don't think that's a worry. Stop worrying about that.
Next question is for Professor Surya. Where do we place Shudra castes, dominant or otherwise, within the framework of sublated Hinduism?
Yeah. Okay. So here is where I make, that's the substantive bit of argument. That is my mic on? Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
See, it is in this very process of turning Hinduism into civil religion that the what you call a Shudra caste, they counter estrangement, right? So here is the very possibility of equality, right? I mean, like I say, this is almost like a de-Brahminized form of newer Hindu religion with full possibilities of countering estrangement, and there is no alienation as such in this religion, this new form, and there is possibilities of inclusion. So very much, yes, sublated Hinduism is about inclusion, right? And that's why we see this growth, right? I mean, if you carefully look at what is happening, why a Lingayat chief minister makes sense in Karnataka, right? Why does a Patel chief minister make sense in Gujarat, right? So there are political compulsions, but there is also this increase newer form of equality, right? Where you don't always need a Brahmin to tell you what Hinduism is and how great it is, right? So this is the new form, the sublated form, and very much inclusive. So
this question is by Balachandra to Siddharth. Any government would need spyware to keep tabs on people hostile to the interests of the state. At the same time, one does not want it of individuals who wanted to overrun the privacy. How do you strike a balance without throwing out the baby with bathwater?
So I didn't follow the question actually.
Yeah, so the question is like, give me a sec. Any government would need spyware to keep tabs on people hostile to the interests of the state. At the same time, the individual privacy also matters a lot.
Yeah.
How do we strike a balance between these two?
Yeah. So clearly the issue is, I'm talking in general terms. The issue is that you have to have some kind of regulatory oversight. You see, in any democracy, in the UK or the US, for example, the executive does not have the authority to take all these decisions by itself, because that is then prone to abuse. So there is a requirement for legal approval either before or after the fact, right? In India, the entire procedure is in the hands of the executive. So I would say that one useful safeguard could be, even though we know how the judiciary sometimes operates, but I think that a useful safeguard could be to not leave matters entirely in the hands of the executive. But I want to underline that this is about regular surveillance. Under the Indian Information Technology Act, the use of Pegasus in any circumstance against any target is illegal, because it represents hacking into a device, which the IT Act does not permit, even for national security reasons.
Thank you. This question is for Professor Surya. There are two questions. These are by Shyam Ratan. You mentioned the informal surveillance that already exists in rural areas towards some groups like women, lower caste, etc. Do you see larger political surveillance we see today as an extension of this phenomenon?
No, this is again, rather, you should turn this around to, I mean, that is what Siddharth was saying, right? Why is he emphasizing that this is such an important question that we should be concerned about, right? And what I am suggesting is that if you look at the larger collective morals, it tells us why we are not concerned about this, right? So there is so much of obsession with a parallel world which is steeped into superstition, which is steeped into hierarchy. Therefore, it also creates the political priorities of different. It's very different. So they are in one sense contradictory, right? I mean, one citizen should be very concerned about surveillance, but ours is a society which would rather have increased surveillance in every place, right? Because the political morals are such that surveillance is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So that's why it works. So it's not that, because I mean, this is like Siddharth said, it's a form of political cunning, right? It's not you cannot use that, cannot say that the village level surveillance is similar to the state surveillance. No, I mean, that's an easy parallel, but a misplaced one to draw, I think.
The same question another question by Shyam. Apart from caste inclusivity, does the Hindutva reformism address the regionally different interpretations of Hinduism?
See, when I suggest that there is sublated Hinduism, there are some foundational arguments which work in the making of this. One is, one evokes greatness of past, right? And that can be varied. These are the stories, these are the literature, right? So, for instance, in Karnataka, you have a set of local personalities which are evoked, right? Which are celebrated as Hindu symbols, right? So every state will have a set of local symbols mixed with national symbols, right? But the whole is created in terms of order, and the order is about a great past that was lost in last 400, 500 years, and something that has to be restored again, right? And some of us may think that scientifically this idea does not work, but this emotional work that goes in creating this passion actually makes a lot of sense. So in terms of, once you create a Hindu whole, Hindu unity, then it's based on a past that has faced violence and brutality, right? It evokes this collective, right? So you are right in saying that regionally it's varied, but the whole is created based on an oppressed past, and the need to go back to the golden age, right, where everything was possible.
This question is for both the speakers. Can the surveillance state that India has become at the present time be traced to India's colonial past? Can we go back to any precedents in the colonial era, or is it just the recent phenomenon?
So surveillance surveillance happens all the time, and if you go back in history, surveillance for espionage purposes, surveillance for against political rivals, this is ongoing. But it's one thing to use kind of private means to spy, to get information, and companies spy on each other. So surveillance is not new, and it's not something that Mr. Modi has invented, right? But what he has done is to raise this to the level of, I would say, a politically corrupt act, because you're using public resources and public bodies, government employees, to generate benefit for ruling political party. So I think this is what, now one could say, fine, maybe Indira Gandhi, maybe others have also done this in the past. They perhaps have. But the scale of targeting and the kind of technology used is something which has, I think, taken it to a qualitatively new level.
Would you like to add, Professor Surya?
No, I think I agree with, see, everything in terms of governmental technologies that are used to discipline us in various forms can be linked to colonial governments. I mean, that's, but when you approach it from the point of view of human rights, right? I mean, it is here the question between the nature of relationship between states and citizens, and that's what, again, that has been emphasizing, comes into play, right? And this is the very reason why we should protest this form of advanced scrutiny of our lives, which the state undertakes. It potentially puts everyone at risk. I mean, not much point there in kind of going back. I mean, one can historicize this, but in terms of the question of human rights and citizenship, this is more of a present problem.
This question is by Uma Shankari to Siddharth. How are you protecting yourself? After all, peeping Tom technology, who can never be detected. Do we need a platform like those which do fake news exposes? Are there any such platforms?
So see, we should not confuse surveillance and countermeasures with fake news, right? And dealing with fake news. These are two entirely separate things. You can have fake news without surveillance. I mean, let's not confuse different issues here. So the Wire as a media platform reports the news and does investigative journalism, and for that reason we are being targeted. We take countermeasures. So certain kind of sensitive conversations we will try to have in person without phones, being aware of the fact that we can be spied upon, but also at the same time not being so struck with fear that we stop doing our work. The fact is that what we do is in the public interest, and what we do is transparent. We are not gathering information to hoard and blackmail and to deal in information. Whatever we gather is to be used for reporting and for writing. The only issue may be that you don't want information to leak beforehand to an interested party. But even in those kinds of situations, like the Pegasus project, at least 48 hours before we informed the public of India about the use of Pegasus, we wrote to the government of India saying, look, we are doing these stories, and do you have any comment? So the point is that the journalism is by nature a transparent enterprise, and so we are not going to be cowed down or become paranoid and stop working for fear of somebody targeting us. At the same time, you have to use precautions. So if there's something that is sensitive and secret, then maybe have a person-to-person conversation. This is entirely different from the fight against fake news, which The Wire and many other media platforms are waging through the kind of work that we do.
This is to Professor Surya. How do we define human in Hindutva? Or put it other way, who is the human in Hindutva?
Right. See, what I was, it should be pretty clear. What I was suggesting was that Hinduism as a civil religion in its sublated form works towards this manushata within Hindus. Right? So it's this is a process of recovery. Right? I mean, who is the human in Hindutva is I think again it's not a good way of understanding the problem. Right. So my research is about the process, right, and therefore this process of manushata as an ideal to work towards solidarity within Hindus is something we need to understand.
Yeah, Professor Surya, there is, I think, related question to what you are saying. This is by Saji Gopal. When the supporters of Hindutva and RSS were responsible for mob lynching, suppression of Dalit Bahujan rights and Muslim minorities and hate speech, is it appropriate to use expressions such as national civil religion? Where is the element of national civility in the fascist Hindutva ideology?
Yeah, it is, here that one has to work with caution. See, I mean, it's very easy to, we really need data on this. So let us just compare on, put together data on caste violence, right? Who is it that is involved in caste violence on ex-untouchable castes, where, and are they affiliated to Hindutva? So you don't, I mean, picking up some cases of, I mean, there are not even, I mean, there are figures, right? They don't match with caste violence. So again, this is rhetorical for me. I'm sorry, does not add up.
This is to Siddharth. This is by question by Ramakrishna. According to you, what are the possible ways to control the dominant use of unlawful surveillance practices by the government or agencies at the seemingly impossibility in controlling the government?
You see, they're only, I mean, in a democracy, people have the right to protest and should protest. People have the right to move the court and they should move the court. People have the right to vote in favor of this candidate or that candidate, this party or that party. So essentially, civil society and the electorate at large has to decide how, what these disclosures mean for them. And as I said, the use of surveillance in this fashion is a very grave assault on democracy. So people have to come up with ways to counter this. And one way is to spread awareness and build public opinion, because governments and courts, may not be that open to the idea of taking, the government will not admit to this, but I'm saying even even the courts need to understand the public sentiment on this matter, that that this is not some issue of that concerns a handful of people whose phones have been targeted. This is a much broader issue. And I think it's incumbent on political parties and civil society organizations to raise this and spread awareness amongst the masses on it.
There is a related question, Siddharth. This is by Sai. Do you think the excessive usage of digital transactions or the use of digital devices implies erosion of our privacy? How can we relate digital India to our privacy rights? Is it a plan to make us more digitized so they can track us?
No, I mean, like, look, I mean, there is a balance that has to be struck between convenience and how much information you are willing to part with, right? So it is a fact that many, like if you look at payments, for example, very often it is convenient, since you carry your phone around everywhere, to use a UPI payment method even for small purchases. You may be buying 50 or 60 rupees worth of vegetables, but you're not carrying cash or change at that time, and so there is a convenience involved. But the fact is that all this information is being gathered, and in the absence of any privacy law in India as of now, and we know what the government's attitude towards privacy is, there's always a danger that this information will be misused. So I think that in an ideal world, people should have the right to make an informed choice about what information they give and to what extent they use electronic devices and what kind of information they share. But their rights also must be guaranteed. I think that we are one of the few democracies where there is still as yet no law in place to guarantee the privacy of citizens. And this is a very, very strange, I mean, you have Aadhaar, you have all kinds of other, technologically advanced methods of identification and transaction being introduced, and sometimes even being made mandatory. But there is no legislative structure in place for protecting people's information and the confidentiality of their information. So I think it's essential that India have a robust privacy law, because people shouldn't be forced to choose between convenience and privacy. It is possible to have convenience and share information on the one hand, but also have your privacy rights protected on the other.
It's a question to Professor Suryakant by Professor Meena Danda. Other than appealing to Hindu unity in speeches, what do Hindutvaadis actually do to undo caste divisions? When caste atrocities against those who transgress caste boundaries, what stand do they take? And how do those who feel pride at singing of national anthem feel them?
Yeah, so this is an important question. Now, it is here that we need to distinguish between Hindutva and Hinduism. A lot of these workers, who are part of RSS organizations, they actually condemn these incidents, right? I mean, they in fact have a very sociological reading of caste violence. So in my paper, I deal with this in detail, and I quote some of them. So what they say is, it is the dominant castes who do not want to give up their power, right? So they are also very disturbed with the idea that untouchable castes are not allowed in temples. There is persistent violence, and so on and so forth. So and it is again here, you should. So there is always this larger kind of discourse that is anti-caste. There should be, if you look at it persistently, it's coming more and more now. There should be no discrimination, right? This is the voice across workers that comes out. So we need to, at least in our own analysis and reading, we need to distinguish between who. It's really misplaced that some of us mix Hindutva and caste violence. They are not the same thing. Caste violence is popular Hinduism. It's Hinduism, right? And Hindutva is a new form of collective solidarity and new form of, like I said, Manushya that they try to evoke, right? So.
This is a question to Siddharth by Rahul Ajit. Sir, the same Pegasus spyware has been have been used to protect a former CJ, that is Ranjan Gogoi. So how do you explain and justify your trust on the judiciary bringing transparency into this?
Well, so far, I mean, it's not a question of having trust or faith. I mean, there is no option anybody has because a number of people have filed petitions in the court and they've gone there because they expect the Supreme Court to play its constitutionally mandated role. And so this is not a question of faith or expectation. This is a question of a person's right to expect that the Supreme Court will follow the Constitution. And frankly, there's no other option other than for us to like the filing of a petition itself means that a citizen is saying, I'm asserting my right to have the judiciary uphold the Constitution on this matter. So sure, the Pegasus was used against Ranjan Gogoi's, the woman who alleged harassment at Gogoi's hands. But so far, I mean, based on what the Supreme Court bench has been saying and the kind of questions they raised, they have not agreed on the face of it to the government's offer of a government-run committee and so on. So I think there is reason to wait and see what the Supreme Court comes up with. Maybe we will have occasion to discuss the pros and cons of the court's approach after the interim order comes, which should be any day or week now, because the Chief Justice mentioned in open court about 10, 12 days ago that they were inclined to set up a committee. And they were looking for members who could be part of this committee that would investigate the use of Pegasus. So let's wait and see.
So this question to Professor Suryakant from Veena Shatrugna. How does Hindutva see reservations? Every reform movement down the centuries ended up further consolidating caste. Will Hindutva do the same?
Now, see here, I mean, again, the question that someone asked, that how do we convince Savarnas about reservations, right? At least in RSS, there is an understanding that reservations is here to stay till you change it constitutionally, right? So even this organization where students were trained, there are a lot of OBC and SC/ST students. They were trained because there is reservations. There is no opposition to reservation which has to be voiced in public, right? Of course, morally, I mean, for most liberals, right, progressive or not progressive, pure caste Hindus, reservation is necessarily a bad thing. It affects merit, right? But that is not something that is always voiced in public openly, and especially in RSS, what we do see is there is a conscious effort towards enrolling, right? Towards, like I said, de-Brahminizing of Hinduism in one sense, to making it a civil religion. So the discourse is not anti-reservation, because most of these people they work with are in one sense reserved, right? So we don't see that kind of aggressive anti amongst the workers, right? So they're very focused. The idea is seva. You work on going beyond caste. Don't evoke caste. Don't talk of caste as much as possible. That's in fact a major strategy. So yeah.
This question is for both the speakers from Murali Karnam. I understand both the creation of civil religion and surveillance state are part of the same project to circumvent the electoral democracy based on liberal civil society. Please comment on that.
Suryakant, you want to go first? I'm not sure I followed the question actually. So
I'll repeat the question, sir. I understand both the creation of civil religion and surveillance state are part of the same project. That is, to circumvent the electoral democracy based on liberal civil society.
Right. I'll quickly kind of see where is liberal civil society in India is limited. So that's the argument I made in my work on civility against caste, that in India we have civil society, but that does not have civility. So you cannot have this some of these organizations, for instance, which are of privileged castes, you cannot claim them to be liberal and civil. I mean, they claim themselves to be liberal, but you cannot call them liberal, right? So you have to use a critical lens. So frankly, I don't see a project of liberal civil society as something bad in itself for a society of like ours, which is so illiberal, right? But we don't have, I mean, we have few progressive currents which are there, but you cannot say we have or we have achieved, and the liberal civil society is working out this newer hegemony. No, I don't think we are there yet.
So you would like to answer?
No, go ahead. I'm fine.
There are two questions to Siddharth. What is the present status of Pegasus case in the Supreme Court? And did NSO reveal the name of the governments that are its clients?
So NSO doesn't reveal the name of any clients, and nothing has changed since our project began publishing stories. So that's the hard reality, and I don't expect that to change. And the Supreme Court has concluded its hearings, and we are waiting for the order, which the Chief Justice said in open court about 10 days ago. They would be pronouncing very soon. So it's basically we are waiting anxiously to see what the court will decide.
This question is to Professor Surya from Sagari Ramdas. You began by gender and caste and the centrality of women's subjugation control to sustain caste as the core of Hinduism. Do you see this as having changed in the Hindu cosmopolitan, and more important, in the Hindutva as the nationalist Hindu? What change do you see, if at all, in the gender caste framing?
So, what broadly, the paper on Hindu cosmopolitanism is published, you can read there. And what I suggest again is that some form of lack of alterity, limited kind of individual freedom is at the heart of Hindu cosmopolitanism, right? So it stays, but it does not mean that there is no freedom for women, right? Now, here's what we need to understand carefully. So there will be freedom, but there is a certain kind of freedom that is allowed, and which is seen as choice, right? So it's not absolute. You have to understand that women in that sense will get freedom, but that freedom itself is a form of, that's why I call it Hindu cosmopolitanism, right? It's not free flowing, it's limited, right? And similarly in fact, you will see in Hinduism as civil religion also there is this current. That's why I pose it in a context. Right? There are these progressive currents, and the Hindutva consistently reshapes itself. And we have to understand that. That's why more women in politics, more women in armed forces, right, is something that is accepted, but there's an idea of what kind of woman also. Right? So you are, to answer briefly, yes, there will be more freedom, right? Gender would be reconstituted, the gendered nature of social, economic, and political roles would be reconstituted towards a progressive form. But there is always the fear of other, right? And also what we see in Hinduism as civil religion, actually the discourse of, being anti-caste is becoming progressive in a Hindu way. So we need to look at these details. So it's a process, there are no I cannot give you, so I'm pointing you to the process, and there are no absolute kind of answers, but you have to look at these processes.
We just have two more questions. This question for both by Ramurthy. What will be the scenario in case BJP comes to power in 2024, both in terms of state surveillance and Hindu aggression?
I'll go first. I think that, one should not speculate too much about what happens in 2024, because the election is wide open. It's 2 to 3 years away. And it's a long time in politics, 1 or 2 years. But clearly the BJP has not shown any sign of remorse or regret, either for the use of surveillance or the aggressive promotion of Hindutva politics and polarization And we can clearly see that in the run-up to 24, they have every intention of intensifying on both counts. So to the extent to which both of these are disastrous for the country, it's clear that things are going to get much worse before they can get better.
Professor Surya, would you like to respond?
I think, this is also what we see in politics is also, it also reflects on the society, right? And so one has to also pose, I mean, if they come back in 2024, I mean, they came back again, right? I mean, so anyways, so what we need to understand is it's also the reflection of collective will. Right. And if the reflection of collective will, it's towards a collectively closed society, right? Intolerant society, that's democracy, right? I mean, that's why I'm saying, that this paradox of high democracy and low civility is not new to India. And we need to carefully, therefore, study the culture and how it, constitutes politics. So therefore, I like Siddharth said that the violation of rules, legality, and idea of freedom has been more in during the BJP rule. But for me, the roots go beyond, before BJP and beyond politics. So we that's why the call for politics beyond institutional politics, right? It's important. And
so this is the last question for the day to Professor Surya. How does Hindutva reconcile with neoliberal project?
Well, there is no reconciliation. It's see, again, I mean, that you should, instead of Hindutva, I mean, there's a call for, if you remember, there's this big talk of Swadeshi and Swadeshi economics. All that is old. No one talks about that anymore. I think we should talk about Hinduism and neoliberalism, right? And I think they are very good bedfellows, actually. Right? So you may be rooted in your caste. You may have, like I said, consumptive cosmopolitanism, which is very materialistic. Right? So, and they seem to go together, right? Unless, I mean, there is also a little bit of withering of caste. We cannot undermine that. But so there is no reconciliation as such. The main challenge is about the nature of individualism. Right? That's the anxiety, and that's why this newer form of civil religion, newer form of caste associations. That's what it is. It's not about markets, is what I'm saying. Right?
Yeah. With this, we come to the end of the question session, which has been really very, very exhaustive. Now we thank both the speakers for their really valuable time. It has been really very enriching. Both the speakers have been very, very elaborate and very patient with the questions and session and everything. Yeah, we thank both the speakers for their valuable time. And we thank all the participants for attending this event. A small announcement, both the talks will be available on Human Rights Forum's YouTube channel in a couple of days. Yeah, with this, we are ending the session. Thank you, one and all. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having us.